And what we're going to talk about now is about where our map has progressed since last time we spoke. Let me go ahead and bring up that map real quick here. Now, some of this is going to be just a little bit of a refresher at the beginning here, and then we're going to kind of talk about how the map has changed. All right, so this is the map layer that we were talking about before, those portal lanes. Again, my major compass rose and my minors, and then those 2 minor points of interest. So what I've done since then is I went ahead and added the land which you guys got to see before. Let's go ahead and turn that back on. Now this is the land during the dry seasons here, and when the water has receded, but that's kind of half the map. If you remember, I talked about having a wet season and a dry season. So during the dry season, it should actually look a little more like this. And I've decided that I'm going to keep the map like this whenever it is the dry season. That way people can see where these, during the wet seasons, fjords would be. Now, you guys can see the rivers right here because they are carved out of that ground layer, or excuse me, the land layer. And this is kind of naturally how they would occur. So when I have my dry season, this is what my map will look like. And then when I have my flood season, that's how the map will look. Now, these rivers kind of don't look like they make a lot of sense because there's no mountains showing right now. So let me go ahead and show you that real quick here. All right, so here are the mountains that I put down. If you guys notice, these mountains are actually quite large for the map, and I did that on purpose. If you look at this map here, which is a previous map that I did, this is again the same size, 2 feet by 3 feet. And essentially, if you look at it, my mountains are quite a bit smaller. Let me go ahead and zoom in on this one. And then I've got these map icons. And the map icons, for the most part, are actually much bigger than these mountain icons. And the reason for that is these are standard size mountains. Now, when we go back over to this unnamed moon that we're building, these are so much bigger. The font size, or excuse me, the brush size is at least double in most cases. Now, let me give you kind of some helpful tips about using brushes. When you use a brush that's preset like these mountains, what you're going to want to do is start in your upper right corner if the shadow casts to the, or excuse me, your upper left corner if the shadow casts to the left. And the reason for this is you want to work top to bottom, left to right. Basically, these shadows will create a natural shadow look here. And when you layer them, you'll get areas like this where these are a couple of these brushes coming together. And if you do your layering correctly, it'll actually kind of hide it and make it look very natural, just like this one right here and this series of mountains right here. So that's kind of a basics of how to set brushes. Now for this set, I forget who actually came out with this one's particular set. If you followed that video by Miss Corey, I believe she uses the same brushes that I do. If not, I would go ahead and check out stuff like DeviantArt because it is very easy to find stuff like that inside there. So let me just do a real quick here and show you how these mountains look just going down, and you'll see what I mean about not crossing these and going above other things. So let's go ahead and pull up one of these mountains here. Sorry guys, I've got quite a few brushes, so this will take a second. Looks like I skipped past them. I do apologize. I wish this was a little better organized. That way it would be a little cleaner for the video here, but you guys kind of get the idea. To have all these brushes is actually quite helpful because when it comes time to do these maps, you have a whole lot of different options. If you notice, I'm at 190 pixels right now. This is about the size that I used on the previous layer, or on the mountain layer. Now, whenever you want to do these things like the mountains, if you notice I have a mountain layer right here, I would always keep it on the same layer. That way, if you want to turn it off or change something, it's always on that one layer and it will not affect your previous layers. I mentioned that GIMP is very similar to Photoshop. I don't know if they necessarily call it layers, but it is definitely in there and you want to go ahead and use it. So let's say for whatever terrible reason, I want to take this mountain chain and go back up like this, right here. If I do that, actually, hold on, that is the wrong color because I was using gold earlier, so let me correct that here. going with the black ink again, just like the previous ones. Let's say I throw that down right there. You see how much of just terrible area this is right here? That's because those shadows are overlapping. Now, what I'm going to do is just step backward and remove that real quick here. That's the general basic idea with the brush, is whenever you're going to do a new type of brush, always start in the left, to the right, and down. And that'll keep you from having any of your shadows looking a little strange. Now, some of these shadows, if you look at them, you will notice inconsistencies, like this chain of mountains right here, which I'm going to switch over to regular mouse so you can see me a little better. This chain of mountains right here. If you look at the shadows from up here and right here, all kind of around here, they all kind of go in a swooping to the right direction, very, very uniformly right. If you look at some of these mountains right here and right here, they're just a little off. Now you can tweak and be a little off, and most people won't notice it if you go about 5 degrees or less on the rotation of that brush. So let's go ahead and bring back up that brush real quick, and I'll show you how to rotate your brush. So I've got this sucker right here, and let's say I want to rotate it. There's a little brush icon right here. If you open that up, you have this great handy dandy tool. It's got all your brushes inside here. The other thing it has is this little kind of like a compass thing. If you adjust this, what it's going to do is change the angle of your drawing. If you look right here, this is very different than how we started at 0. Let me go ahead and shift it back to 0. Here is normal, and let's shift it to 45 just to kind of show the difference. Here is 45. All right, so obviously these are two very different things right here. So let's go ahead and undo those real quick. Those were also on the wrong layer, so they looked a little funny. Here's the 45 on the correct layer, and here is the 0 on the correct layer. You notice that the shadows are kind of now going upward. They're always going to remain the same when you use a brush like this, and you can make brushes like this. It's actually quite easy. You'll start with a square canvas. You'll design what you want, and then you capture it and set it as a brush. I believe Infinite Roleplay actually just did a continent brush video. If I can find the link for it, I'll include it in the description on this one. Basically, to make a continent brush is the same thing that you would do to make a normal brush, to include mountains. So if you decide that you don't want your mountains going to the right, you want them going to the left, that would be the best way to kind of set that up. So that is basically why you can get away with it. Now, for the shadows that we were talking about here, the 5 degree difference. So now I go to 5 degrees, and you can see that they're very similar. This one is just a hair different than this one, but it is close enough that you can kind of cheat and get away with that. You can do that at 5 degrees and at -5 degrees, and not a huge amount of difference. When you start going past about 15 degrees or so, that's really where you start to see a whole lot of difference. I mean, even at 15 degrees, that's not terrible, but I wouldn't go any further than that. So that is just kind of an example of how to abuse and use the shading that you have provided for you from some of these preset brushes. Now, you can also do X and Y flips. If you wanted to do your shadows on the left-hand side, what I would recommend to you is go ahead and set that brush to 0, and then go ahead and do an X flip. If you notice the mountains look kind of weird now, that's because they're now going the opposite direction. Same principles apply. You can shift it up or down about 15 degrees, and it will, or 15 degrees or less, both directions, and it should look just fine and be comparable with the rest of your content that you have on the map. All right. Now, if you're wondering why shading goes to the right in a lot of maps, that has to do with handedness, to be honest with you. A lot of artists typically are right-handed, just because that's a general populace thing. And because of that, it is easier to draw the shape, and then as you're drawing the shape, create the shadow, because one of the principles about drawing any sort of perspective or something with depth and shadows is to draw from the shadow, not necessarily what the object is, but to create the shadows and then move forward to the object, to create suggestive lines and things like that. These drawings, you can see some of the suggestive lines, like there's little mountain streaks that kind of come down here, and you know that they're mountains just from the shape of them, but you don't necessarily need something that identifies it clear cut like you would see on a little children's drawing, where it's kind of this triangle thing and they say it's a mountain. So that's kind of what a leading line is. Now, for the game and how I'm going to do it, there's a couple rivers inside here that I wanted to point out. This mountain chain, I really liked the way it developed. So I created this lake up here, and then I have kind of this spider web of rivers that cut through here. Now, I talked about my land being 2 separate layers. There's actually a cheat, like a little cheat trick that I did here. I essentially went to my wet season only. I had my mountains down, and I started my rivers at the mountains and moved them out to the oceans, or outward in some cases. You'll see some dead-end rivers here. And then when you see the dry season map, you'll see some dead-end rivers on there. This is basically because rivers do flow from mountains to oceans or to a low enough point to where they eventually end up going into the earth. And that's definitely a principle you want to keep if you want to maintain a realism to a world that your players can understand. Now, there are some other rules of rivers and things like that that follow that that generally they will flow any direction except for north. There are very few rivers in the real world that actually flow northward, the Nile being the most iconic one. That doesn't have to hold true in your world, but it is nice to have something similar to that in your world. Say that none of your rivers flow to the east. My world does happen to have things that flow to the east because iconically I'm going to keep this as north. So these are kind of my east flowing rivers. That's not going to work for mine. I've even got some that are going west, south, and actually it doesn't look like I have anything that really goes too far north. Now this one kind of spider webs, and you may be wondering why it does that now that I'm talking about how my rivers are not going northward. The reason for that is this area right here is actually, let me just kind of put a box around that. This area right here is actually flatlands. What rivers will do is kind of weird stuff in flatlands. If you look at like the Amazon or the Yangtze River, they kind of spread out and worm around. And you can take advantage of that, but understand that what you're creating is flatlands in that area. It should be good for harvesting and for any sort of farming and things like that in that area, because one, it's very irrigated with all this water here, and two, it's flatlands. It's going to be very good fertile soil. That kind of brings me around to city placement. Let me just get rid of this selection here. So we've got this big map to play with, and I've got my mountain layer. What I want to do is just go ahead and create a new layer. From here, I'm just going to name this one cities. Now, I know what you're thinking. I don't have any forests down. I don't have any sort of swamps down, deserts and things like that. I don't like to put down those features until after I've thought about my cities. It's just a personal preference. A lot of people develop their other geological features and environment features beforehand. I like to start with hard geographic features, which would be your continents, your lands, your oceans, your mountains, things like that, rivers, things that are going to be harder for man to manipulate, just because it's easy for my brain to go there. Well, now, before I get too much further, I wanted to point this out here. I've got this highland right here that drops into the lowland, and then there's like this lake that forms. That's because these mountains are actually draining here, and then if you notice, it kind of comes down and hugs what would be this island during the wet season. And you can see that these rivers kind of flow in between these areas here, and then they exit out to the ocean. The reason for that is inside these gullies here, or valleys, depending on what they are. I'm thinking they kind of feel more like gullies from the looks of it. The river will go to its lowest point and flow outward. And since this area is pretty wash about half the year round, it allows the river to actually flow pretty evenly. Now, this is kind of just a peak moment in the season. When we are transitioning from the wet season to the dry season, this map will still technically look wrong. And that's going to be part of the fun of the game, actually, is the players will go out during that transition of seasons when they can travel and they can go to the lowlands, but they're having to go through partially flooded lands to be able to find their villages and cities that they had set up before the rivers rose, or excuse me, the world waters rose. And so that's definitely a feature that, like this area, which during the dry season would be incredibly fertile just because of how much freshwater saturation that it got. For the first couple months, it would actually be bad to use just because it would be oversaturated, but after a few months of cultivating the earth and getting it ready, it can actually be used for quite a bit of stuff. In fact, those first couple months when it's bad, it would actually be perfect for rice to be cultivated then. These are just kind of little things that you can think about. Rice goes in rice paddies. So because we have this shallow river condition for a couple months in the transition between seasons, that would be an awesome time to set up rice, which means rice could be pulled twice a year, meaning that I can take note and think that rice should be a big, important staple in this world. Kind of like I said, sailing is going to be really important in this world because the land will change. And here's the part that I really liked. Your merchants and your traders have to really think about this stuff, because if, let's say I am to place a city right here, because this right here is actually a pretty golden opportunity for a city. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and place one there. Let's go ahead and go back to our brushes, and I'm going to find a city real quick. I'm thinking this one's going to be a Metropolis because it is in a perfect location. I'll kind of explain why I think it's a perfect location here in a second. So I've got these little ones. These little guys, I always think of them as villages, so I don't really pay much attention to them. I like these towers as keeps and castles, really more as keeps. All right, guys, sorry about that. It's about halfway through my video, so of course my mic died. So this tower right here, I like to use it for watchtowers, keeps, things like that, military stations. It's a good identifier, and you'll find that if you keep uniformity amongst your maps, even if you change your stylings, your players will easily be able to read the maps. That's kind of the strong point of any map, is having a uniform understanding of what it is. Now these ones right here, these are a different style of tower, but if you look at them, they've got kind of like this weird like chimney stack kind of a look to them. I've used them as shrines before. I don't think that's quite what I'm looking for right now. Since this is going to be a big metropolis, I don't think maybe like a walled fort type castle, maybe that's what I'll use them for, is like a fort that's walled, and these to be like more like watchtowers in the frontier kind of a deal, which we'll kind of play with and see what we like. What I'm thinking is for this trade town, now I've got these, which are kind of, these are labeled as keeps, but I've used them before for designating big cities. And the best part about this brush set is you've got white and black versions of everything. So each piece will actually have a duality to it. So let's say I want to use one of these keep ones for the city. I'm still not feeling that, so let's actually shoulder over here to the castle. Let's say I want the big, bad, awesome capitals to be black roofed, but I want my big cities, with my big walled cities, metropolises and things like that, to be this castle icon right here with the white roof. So go ahead and take a look at that, and then if you look, my castle is actually quite small compared to those mountains, but we're gonna actually take it down a notch even more so. Let's kind of zoom in where we need to be. Oh, I forgot to mention this earlier. I added this little whirlpool right here. The portal lanes were pointing to here, and I felt like it needed something. So I kind of added this idea that there is a underwater trench, or maybe a methane gas vent that's open, and it's creating torrential storms and poor waters here for sailing. And since this world is very dependent on sailing, I'm going to have things like sea monsters and things like that, but we'll get to that when it comes time. I just thought that was kind of a nifty feature, and I'll have stuff like water jets and spouts in the area, in addition to this pretty much permanent storm over the area. So sailors are aware of it, and I'm probably going to have some sort of myth behind it. Now, since I showed you guys this brush tool, this is the one that I actually really like. Right now, I am actually using a mouse to do what I'm doing, because I'm just placing I'm stamping basically. For drawing the lands, I didn't mention it in the last video. I do use a tablet, just a cheaper bamboo tablet. There's a lot of good ones you can get, but the cheap one will do the trick, and I actually like the cheap one over the more expensive one, because they're less sensitive. And that sounds a little silly, but when you start carving out these lands and your hands are getting tired, if you have one that's really sensitive, there's a chance that you're going to get some odd looking things, because your hand will naturally start to go in a repetitive fashion, which is why I recommend you watch something or turn on a Pandora or anything to kind of get your mind distracted from what you're doing, because that same repetitive like cutting in task will will catch on you. And I don't remember if I mentioned it during a previous video, but if you were to use differential clouds as a stencil, that also sometimes helps. Now, I like this city being placed right here. Now, this is a referential map. This is not 100% where this city is. So I still want to get the city pretty much where I like it. And it's okay if it dips a little bit into this lake, because again, this map is more for reference. So I like this location right here. Let's go ahead and set one down. There it is. All right, so I mentioned it before, when I run Google and YouTube, or excuse me, Google's live stream and my Photoshop at the same time, it comes a little slow, so kind of bear with me here. You see how light that is? I don't like that. It's actually quite a bit lighter than even my mountains, and it's going to be a little distracting. So let's take that off. We'll go ahead and replace it. Now, the reason I'm taking it off is because I want to center it. Then I'm just going to double click it. That'll get it a little bit darker, and that's pretty good. I think it's hanging too much in the lake, so let me correct that real quick here. All right, that looks pretty solid. So I've got my major metropolis right there. And so I told you that I was going to tell you why I think this is a perfect location. Okay, so having it in the highlands means it's going to be safe. The highlands should be where my metropolises are, because that's going to be the most safe location for anyone. During the flood seasons, those cities are going to remain above water, and they should serve as castles did in medieval society. People are going to take shelter there during the poor weather seasons, and then they're going to return to the lives of farming during the good weather seasons. Now, being that this world has kind of a dualistic nature, this land up here is still going to be harvestable, and I'm going to have kind of irregular crop growing seasons. But as far as what crops will grow due to elevation and things like that, that's totally different. And frankly, I may make some stuff up. I like the idea of rice paddies down here during those transition months. That gives them 2 times to harvest rice, like I mentioned. And I think that's pretty solid. I'm probably going to keep that. Because rice is a pretty easy staple for people to have. It ran kingdoms for many, many years. And so I think that's a good solid place to just kind of have a generic staple. Now, I wanted to point this out too, since we're all zoomed in. I've got this river actually going in between the mountains. If you look, my shadows are there. You can take the time to clean up those shadows, or you can just leave it as is. I'll probably actually double back and clean that up later. For right now, I just placed it down so that I could get my rivers in place and start winding them where I needed them to go. Now back to this city. So during the high season, it's going to be safe. During the low season, it's going to be safe. So I've got these rivers that are dumping out from the mountains. They'll come in here and form kind of a reservoir in this lake, and then it will waterfall down to this next lake. Now, what you may be thinking is this is actually kind of a terrible place to set up for the dry season, because boats can't get up there. Now, this is where you get kind of creative. You have a world that this is the norm. So they're going to have things like floodable underground docks and passages. So I'm going to put some docks right inside here. Probably, let me switch over to the mouse. Probably right in this area right here as the waterfall lets up. So say you're a trader, you're going to have a boat kind of like something that a Viking would use that can travel up rivers. So you would come up these rivers, which are probably going to be a little bit deeper rivers than normal, and then you're going to come up and travel through here. Now that I'm thinking about it, I'm probably going to want to widen this river just a little bit to make it a little bit more believable, because this channel right here is extremely narrow. I could probably get away with saying that that's good enough, but I'll probably have to just double back and clean that up, which we'll do here in a second. But essentially, you come up here, you come around the lake, there's this beautiful waterfall, and then bam, it's almost like it comes out of the mist. There's docks here. You leave the docks and you travel up this staircase that is almost moist, and you hear your boot steps click with every step as you travel up this staircase. Sconces are lit upon the wall, and you can smell the scent of burning ash wood. So there's a really neat scene right here for this little unnamed village. Well, city, I should say, because it is going to be a major metropolis, because this is probably the best place to get stuff shipped around. Now, I could create a contending city that would go over here, and that's not a bad location. In fact, that may be a great location now that I'm looking at it, because during the dry seasons, let's go ahead and slap one down here. So we have that same effect. Again, double click, make sure it's dark. We have this river here, which is great for the wet season where it's more flooded. Then during the dry season, we have this secondary dock down here, which I'm going to say is a river dock. I don't think they should be taking too much traffic like this city does from the river. And the reason I say that is because during the dry months, this city has a great advantage that the northern city doesn't have. So the northern city, because of terrain, can travel across this lake and trade down here, which is easy enough, and it'll be able to trade across through here. Awesome, perfect. But to get trade outside of that continent, for lack of a better term, this city will become infinitely more important, because what will happen is you will be able to come down into their lower dock section, which maybe they have an elevator system or something. I'm not going to define it just yet. So you come down and you get to the lower level. Now you have this lower level, which will allow you to go to this island, and there's definitely going to be some sort of like trade city for the dry season here, because this is such a short gap. It's like going between Russia and Alaska, except for the water's probably a little bit better than that, and you won't die of hypothermia. So I'm thinking a trade city here, and then like a city here, or maybe, actually, I think maybe a trade city right here would be perfect, because that land is prime. There's like a little bay in there and everything. So let's drop one down right there. Now, I just realized I made an error, because if you look, when I go ahead and flood the world, let me do that real quick. I've got an island, I've got a city that is just right there in the middle of the water. So let's go ahead and remove that sucker. Or click here. All right, so let's go ahead and put that there, and let's correct our layer. So anytime you do anything during your map, don't be afraid to change things. So this is cities, we'll say flood season. Perfect. De-flood season. It's de-flood. All right, boss, let's go ahead and move forward here. Let's do another layer here, and I'm going to call this one cities dry season. This map is awesome because this idea I have of having a flood world that goes through dry and wet seasons, I can do 2 maps in one file and get it all done. And really, I just need to save 2 images, this one where it's all dry, and then the one where it's flooded. My players will know exactly what I'm shooting for. So there's definitely going to be a major trade city there. I'm almost thinking that this city should not be a major one. It's a small amount of land. I'm thinking it should be more of a trade port, like a hub. It's definitely going to be bigger than like a typical village. And because it is trade, I want it to be more of like a keep. So I've got these 2 keep icons here. Since it's definitely going to be more protected, I think I'm going to go with the dark. And I usually rank it like this, just because that's the way my stamps are arranged, or my paintbrushes are arranged here, is I have white first, then black first. And I think of it as like level 1, level 2, if you will. So this is my level 1 keep, which would be a standard keep. You would find probably a couple rangers out there. It's a very easygoing thing. And then keep number 2, or level 2 here, is going to be a little bit more severe. That is going to be stuff like, yeah, they're going to have rangers and other stuff like that. But they are also going to be more of like a city involved in that one. So definitely gonna go ahead and set that down here. And this one, the land is pretty narrow, so just kind of find the best place for that. Now you'll notice these black stamps show up a little better. I still double click it because it creates unity, and I suggest you do the same. So there is our nice little trading route here, and then we can start looking at other places. Oop, that went too far. This island right now is pretty much useless. Let's kind of be honest here. Now, when I start putting down land, I may find that there is when I start putting down like agriculture and I start putting down trees and things like that, or Well, really, I don't map agriculture. I map trees and rivers and mountains, just to kind of get a simplistic nature. Like I showed you this one, that is all this one is. Essentially, this map was designed in the same way. You have your mountains, your city, or your villages, I should say, your large castle, and then your forests. Um, this is kind of a great example of how to stamp these brushes poorly. Um, I'm fairly certain I was probably half asleep when I was doing this one because there are some pretty bad spots inside here, like right here and right here. If you follow my suggestion, your forest should look a little bit more like this section right here. You're all pretty uniform and not having any problems. Your mountains should look about like these. These are pretty solid. This is pretty bad. Um, as you develop maps, like I said earlier, you are definitely going to improve. So just go ahead and do the maps. You're going to find that you enjoy just going through the process, or you may find that you just don't like going through the process, but it will give you an appreciation for people who do go through those maps and stuff like that. I did a similar thing on this one as I was talking about with that trade city. I have the major waterway that comes in and comes over to the major castle here, King's Rest. If you guys hadn't guessed it, this is kind of a Game of Thrones inspired style map, and the play for it was actually very Game of Thrones, but with fantasy involved, kind of a nature of a game. But that's another map. If you notice, like, this is what I was talking about with your hand starting to get repetition. If I follow up this coast right here, you can kind of see that my hand did the exact same movement of knifing in here. I just kind of carried that through. That is kind of lazy coast. It looks great until you get really close. You can do interesting stuff with knifing, like this city right here. Let me pull this up here. This city right here, Port Argus. Port Argus, if you see, there's all these little strips of land out here. What this is Port Argus is mainly this city right here, but it actually got too big for its britches, and people started building more docks. They are one of the major ports in the world, but they're also very low rent, is kind of the best way to put it. The difference between the upper class and the lower class here is immense. If you live in the city, you are rich, period. If you live anywhere near the docks, or I should say on the docks, because a lot of this is residential, it's kind of like the canals in Venice, but it's on the ocean, so it's much worse. You get waves and stuff like that, and people's houses, especially right here, that's going to be your cheapest living because you stand a very good chance of being swept away in the ocean. As you go closer and closer to the port, it gets more expensive. And then once you hit the city wall, or even the land, really, it gets quite a bit more expensive. To go past the city wall, we're talking nobles and people who have worked their way up through the shadowy underground. In fact, that's one of the major thieves guilds happens to make a base out of there in that campaign. So these are definitely some features that you can take a look at and use inside your map. I wanted to show you a more complete map to kind of talk to you about stuff like this. This is another one of those flatlands things that I was talking about, but what ended up happening, because it's oversaturated, it created a swamp, which is what these little grasses indicate. And then I've got the swamp giving way to a Badlands area. It's not actually identified on here why it's Badlands, or you don't have any map markers that shows it's a Badlands. But I've made that clear to my players that this is just kind of crummy land, and the guys that live here are very hard because they either have swamps or badlands. And if you find that you don't have a marker, if you just tell your players and give them an idea of who the people are and why they're the way they are because of their land and things like that, it totally makes sense, and they'll get 100% buy-in. And like right here is an interesting feature. Now, none of my players actually made it to this little island, and I don't have anything showing on there because there's actually a secret monastery of monks that practice here. And these rocks right here are used for training. Essentially, they jump rock to rock and perform martial arts. All right, this is a record. Two times my headset has gone out during the broadcast. I apologize. It is a wireless headset, and if I'm not talking to other people and the speakers don't work, it shuts itself off automatically. Anyways, so that is Mythic Monk Island, if you will. It didn't really get a name because I figured I'd just wing it when the players got there. Now, that is one of the major important things that I want to tell you about. When you draw your map, Dungeon World uses this phrase, draw a map and leave blanks. I think it's a great philosophy. Essentially, what I did is, if you notice, half my villages and things like that, more than half, don't have names. What I did is I named the ones that were important for my story. And then if the players saw a side quest or something that took them to another place, I would take them to another place. Now, these are the shrines that I was talking about right here. And let me highlight that right here. Now, this shrine I told you was important for the story, and that there's a couple of them around. Well, the shrines have no names because they were dedicated to old false gods. And that's actually something that's quite a bit important. If you find that you have things that are important that should have no names, definitely do not give them names. If the players want to call it something, let them. Don't correct them, just let them call it what they want. The same can be said about your monsters. There was somebody who posted in one of the groups with a picture of this ferocious beast that looked like it had 4 arms and was made of magma, possibly a demon, something like that. And he was asking what he should call it for his players. And I made the mention that, you know, if it's something that the players have never seen before, or the world is not familiar with, like intimately familiar with, enough to have legends, lore, or seen on a regular basis, let your players name it. Because chances are, if they're having a good time with the story, they're going to name it something serious. If they're kind of a beer and pretzels table like mine, you may end up with them calling him Deadbag, which is kind of their favorite term for NPCs. A lot of the time when it's an NPC that they know that they're going to fight, that guy doesn't even get a name registered inside their thoughts. He is Deadbag. Unless he happens to hand them their own asses, and then they might call him something like Chip. But definitely let your players have a little bit of creative authority, and that's where this whole draw a map and leave blanks is. So I've got these cities that are definitely not named. That is one part of it, of the blanks, is that I have these unnamed cities, and I may turn to one of my players and say, hey, Jeremy, you guys are heading to this city. I haven't named it. What would you like to name it? Tell me a little bit about the city, because I haven't planned anything about the city. Because Jeremy happens to be playing, well, not in this game, but let's say Jeremy happens to be playing a scout. So Jeremy scouts ahead, and he checks out this village, and he reports back to his leader. And I go, okay, Jeremy, what'd you find out? What's the city named? What's the city like? So Jeremy now has creative authority to tell me the name of the city. And maybe he calls it, let's see, we've got Brokenstone Watch, the Ironwood, Saltwood Keep. It probably has some sort of keep or woods or strong or some sort of masculine name. So let's say he goes with something like Cold Ridge. I like Cold Ridge. It's kind of close to the mountains. And he says it's Cold Ridge is a place of kind of thinner men. It looks like disease has passed through the town. They seem to be malnourished. That gives me an idea of what the region is like. Like maybe their malnourishment is due to a recent famine. It could be due to bad season. They could have a poor king in charge of them. If you notice, I've done a little bit of dotting here to just kind of show the division between lands. There's more divisions that happen. This is kind of how the game started. This land is actually part of Ridgedale. Lord Ridgedale happens to be kind of a terrible lord for the people. He cares for the settlements that he has personal interest in. So when the party started, Brokenstone and Saltwood Keep and the Ironwoods were of immense interest to him, because the Ironwoods, that's where ironwood could be found. So Seamus O'Seamus, it was his terrible NPC name, of Ridgedale, he coveted this land quite immensely. So these keeps were heavily guarded, and that's where the forces of Candlestone, my players, got their first foothold, is they took over Saltwood Keep in a political maneuver, and then they took over Brokenstone in a militaristic maneuver. Kind of like Game of Thrones, this got them in a little bit of trouble because they weren't supposed to conduct war without the permission of the king, because it's disruptive to the people. The world is more or less solidified by this understanding that if you start war, the chances are the king is going to march his legions on you and crush you. They were able to kind of diplomacy their way out of it, and if you ever get in the situation, definitely show your players to constantly ram it down their throats. It makes for a more interesting game if you give them a chance to try and work with the king or queen and explain their actions. And that's what I did here. Again, these are just kind of side notes that involve the world, and these are the kind of stories that you can evolve from a map. So let's say, again, Jeremy has Cold Ridge up here, and he talks about it. And I go, okay, well, I understand that. I know that Ridgedale has these verdant woods right here, and there's the iron woods. And I would say that normally it's very green land inside here. It maybe not the best land to harvest. It may take a lot of work, but there's definitely been some sort of foul weather in this area. So because we already went with this cold idea, I would think maybe the season before there was a cold snap and it just killed all this air, of vegetation. And now I have to think about what is their actual needs, things like that, because every city is going to have what they supply and what they need. And those are things that you definitely want to think about. So they're going to need food. What they can supply, though, is quite a bit limited. They can give fish. That's going to be a pretty easy resource for them from the ocean here. Their rivers, maybe. It's probably more limited, and it's probably a lot easier for them to get fish from the ocean. But they're going to pretty much need any other food that they can get their hands on. So using this river as a trade route, they're probably going to stop by this village, this keep, this village right here, and ultimately end up in Ridgedale, where they can trade for stuff like farming tools that may have been destroyed or seeds and things like that they need. And thinking about those needs may get your players on a side quest. You may have players who come to Cold Ridge here and they think about, oh, this place is dying and we want to win over the people. Well, how's the best way to win over starving people but to provide them with food? Food for one meal is great, but if you provide them with seeds, or in the phrasing of the Bible, teach a man to fish, he's gonna do better. And in fact, if you think about it, I as a person would rather receive help in the form of getting seeds that I can cultivate and do my own part of it than if I receive just a free meal. And so I think about that as just kind of a general tone, and that's the way that I'm going to say that the people of Cold Ridge are. If you want to earn their respect and gain a little honor with them, that's going to be the way to do it, is to help them through their crisis. Any tiny bit of help will earn them respect, because inside this world, I made that kind of key, is that respect is very, very important, kind of like in Viking games. Respect and honor are definitely a thing inside here. Now, the people will blatantly lie to you all the time, and you kind of have to be aware of that. But someone who is truthful and just is given quite a bit of leeway in the world. So those are just kind of basic principles. Now, let's kind of page back real quick here over to the flood world. So let's just double check and make sure both those cities went away. Perfect. And they're back. So we definitely know that that's going to be a great spot. That's going to be a great spot. And these two, to create the bridge between the continents, are definitely going to be important spots. And I like this idea of there being one side that is just not as prosperous due to its land size. I mean, that's tiny compared to this over here. So that's definitely important. This island is kind of like this one over here. It doesn't look important right now. But I'm curious, because if I don't put a city up here, the residents of this city, when it floods and gets taken over, will have actually quite a bit of trek before they get over to another city, which would be right around here. And I almost think that that's too far. So maybe I can put like a village or something right here, and then another one right here. I think that'd be good. It would allow the people to actually split up, which could create an interesting situation, because you could have, like, let's say I mentioned that dichotomy between the rich and the poor. Maybe the rich can afford to take that longer travel over here, whereas the poor have to go to this one right here. So during half the year, your people that normally reside in this city and call this city home are split. So when they come back home, they have different political agendas and they have different understandings, which could create a lot of interesting politics in this city. So because as I'm talking about it, I like it. We're going to do the same thing we did before. I want a large city over here, 2 clicks, and a large city. I like it. Actually, I really like it right here on the peninsula. That gives it a couple interesting options. So that is kind of just how I go about it. That is, of course, on the wrong layer now that I'm looking at it. This is for the flood season. We're going to go right there and right there. All right. So again, when you place down your stamps, just double check your work and make sure it all makes sense. Perfect. So we're going to have, so we'll call this Baker's Port for now, and then we'll have like Rich Town over here, which will be kind of an interesting situation because, like I mentioned, they're going to come over here and have a lot of problems, but they're also going to have a lot of plotting amongst themselves during the off seasons. So the players, if they get involved over here, may find that they get a different story than what they're getting over here. That is basically how I set it up. I'd look at places that seem like good trade routes because ultimately everything is going to revolve around trade. Every city, like I said, has a need and a resource at least. And you want to think about what their resources and needs are. Some cities will literally be set up just for trade. This city right here, absolutely for trade. Because it's going to be a submerged city, it's going to have a lot of stonework. And I think I'm going to carry that over to this city at least, where the poor people live, because a lot of the poorer class are going to be the ones that built this city. And so they're going to have a pride in both places. And while this city is where the rich live, this one may actually be a little nicer to visit because there's craftsmen and things like that fall into this poorer class that live over here. This one was probably built by rich people who paid other people to do it. And so it's probably going to be a little bit more systematic and formal over here. You may end up with a little bit more lush environment here. Those are definitely some things to think about. Let's take a look somewhere else. All right. So, oops, went too far. So right here, this is an interesting bit of land, and I'm going to think about it a little bit more. Tentatively, I'm thinking that there should be a city right in here in the smack in the middle. My only concern is the world is going to have a lot of rain in it, or I should say the moon is going to have a lot of rain in it. If I put it there, that's kind of prime location for flooding even during wet and dry seasons. So that's not a great place. I may end up having one of them like up to the north and then one of them down here. And then just kind of let this area in the middle be split into harvesting and like small villages and things like that. So let me page back here. I've got these villages listed right here. Now these villages are larger villages. Things like thorps and small villages, I actually don't even place on the map. And the reason for that is going back to that draw with blank spaces idea is if my players get to, let's say, right here, and I want to have an adventure today, doesn't matter. I know that they're traveling from Sandalwood to Ridgedale. What I would do to kind of encourage adventure within the city is I might do something like, oh, your trail rations have spoiled, but you're in luck. There's a village coming up. And they see this little village, and maybe it's got 50 people, and that's why it's not on the map. People just don't really know or care. They've just, when you get to these smaller numbers, they have to be self-reliant. So you would want to make sure that they have like woods around them, and maybe they're just not big enough to be mapped kind of woods. They should have water resource, which could be from a well. Very easy to handle that. Generally, they will probably be on a road, so it does make it very easy for the fact that they were traveling from Saltwood Keep to Ridgedale. And now that they're inside that village, I can introduce them to NPCs. And this village, being kind of a poorer village, doesn't have a lot of food and things like that. Say that they had a couple children go missing, and they say, you know, oi, we'll be able to help you, but we need you to help find the children. So the PCs take on that adventure, and they go find the children. And it's maybe just a little quick tangent side adventure, but they get to meet some NPCs, establish some player arcs and things like that, and maybe make a contact or a friend inside that village. They get to refill their rations and move on. Or it could be something explosively huge. Say that there is no village, and they just come across this spot, and I decide, okay, this is where I'm going to have something happen. You could just have like a force show up that your PCs have no idea of or understanding of why they're there. Just like a mercenary band that is riding through the area. and they just happen to pick the PCs to mug or steal from for that day. You can definitely do that. I don't do what's called random encounters. I do adjusted encounters, I guess is the best way to put it. Essentially, I think about what makes sense in the area. I create a random table, and then if I feel the need for a random encounter, I will roll on my encounter table set up specifically for that region. It was an idea that I first saw with a West Marches style game, and I really like that idea to have this idea that you can have repeated enemies and encounters in certain areas to kind of give you a feel for the environment. So like here where the woods are, I would have a lot of wolves in that area. In fact, I have one character that was raised by wolves, and this is where he's from in this general region. So it definitely kind of depends on where you are in the story, but use the map to further your story. Now, I wanted to take just a quick couple minutes here to talk about the gods. We mentioned it last time about Samwise 7 stuff with the different domains. I misspoke. I said I was going to do a nature and death god. I originally kind of wrote this down, and then I didn't have my notes with me for that cast. Essentially, what I'm going to do, let me just turn off the map real quick here. So essentially what I'm going to do is actually a god of the moon and nature. Think like Mother Earth, but because it's on a moon, it's going to be moon in nature. Now this planet, or this moon, will have a planet that it will orbit, and then that planet will also have a second moon. So there's going to be a blue moon and a white moon, which I have to think of names, but something like that would probably work just fine. Like I said, a lot of this world, we're going to do custom content, so I can show you some of the features of hacking and changing a system to fit your needs. Because honestly, you can do it with any system. Having a good baseline system is an excellent start. So because I want something that's kind of fantasy, that's not super out of the norm, I wanted to start with 5th edition D&D. So I've got the Moon and Nature God. I've got a set of twins. One is all right, there we go. I really need a better mic for this setup if I'm going to keep doing live hangouts. So we've got a Fire and Light, who is the god of illumination, and we've got the twin, which is Water and Darkness, the god of obfuscation. I'm going to screw that word up every single time. Obfuscation. There we go. Obfuscation. My friend Nate actually came up with those two gods, and he had to use a word that I can't really say very well. So thank you for that, Nate. So the idea is to have these twins. And so I got to thinking about these twins, and I thought, wouldn't it be neat if like maybe the moons of this planet, or the satellites that are in orbit with it, the planet and the moon of that planet that's not the one you're on, maybe those two correlate to those gods. So I've got one that is Water and Darkness, and then I've got one that is Fire and Light. So it depends on how I want to go about it. I could go thinking about it like maybe one is brighter than the other. Or I could go with both of those are the domains of them. And when we see, because this planet circles a star, which the moon circles the planet, and the second moon circles that planet. So you're going to see from the perspective of being out in space, essentially, kind of like in any of the NASA footage, the sun rising around the planet, creating a sunrise and a sunset. You're going to see the moon eclipses and things like that from the perspective of space. So maybe the dualistic nature of the light and dark on both of those represent those gods, and that they're in this constant struggle moving around each other. Just kind of some ideas that I'm tossing around. I also have Kuru, which is a god of magic and knowledge. By the way, the twins are Elo and Nit, and the moon nature god is Sion. And then I've also got Trickery and Illusion, which is Esdar. That's kind of a standard god that you typically see in most environments. And then I've got another kind of hyper stereotypical god, Malkor, which is my god of death and destruction. Malkor is kind of kind of weird though. His title, or I shouldn't say his, because that god is of unknown gender, is Watcher of Souls and Ruination. That god is going to have a dualistic nature kind of built into it. Essentially, it's the Watcher of Souls, and that's its very solemn, kind of neutral, maybe even holy kind of aspect. And then Ruination. It's kind of like saying if Michael or one of the saints was to be the one who carried out your ruination, in addition to being the one that carries you to heaven. It's kind of an odd dichotomy that you see inside that one. I've got Rayfon, who is the goddess of crafts and protection. She's actually going to be my goddess of civic duty. So I got this crazy idea that I would like. You usually see gods of cities, and they're more of a masculine, or they're traders, or it's like cities and prophets, or trade and cities. Because of the trade city idea that I had right here on the cross bridge between the continents, it made me think that a god would smile upon that city as far as the people are concerned, and that's where Rayfon comes in. The people are concerned about crafts, and then there's the protection of who they are, their lands, and things like that. And any city god is going to provide protection ultimately. The next one is Abris, the god of trade and travel. Pretty standard god, but I thought trade needed to be paired with travel specifically because of this world and flooding. The travel is super important, and the trade is going to be as well. As I start to put these cities down, we're going to see how the trade evolves. And just like in this video, the next video, I'll probably show you a little bit more of my map as it evolves. And as the story kind of progresses and we start to see more content, we'll put more cities down. Now, if you notice, I haven't put down what races live where. We're going to save that for another time because races aren't important at this point. They are important slightly, but for the major cities that are going to be predominant and make sense because of trade and function in the world, you don't need to know what races are going to go there, because any logical race will take up those residences. When we start putting, let's say, elves in the mix, yeah, the elves are going to go to cities that they find beauty in, but there's still going to be a reason for that city. So let's say I have some river dwelling elves, which, for lack of a better term, we'll just use wood elves as an example. My wood elves happen to really like this area. So they're going to set up a city inside the, I'm sorry, I forgot I turned off the map. They really like the area where there's a lot of rivers coming off the mountain. So they will set up a city in between those rivers, where I was talking about it being a flood point, which maybe they don't care because they live in giant trees. And if there's floods, they're already in the trees and the water isn't going to bother them. You'll see cities like that crop up due to the nature of the environment rather than the necessity. So in this stage, think about necessity, not nature of the people. All right, going back to the gods, let's see. We talked about Abris. Ibtar is the god of life and stars. Again, navigational world, so stars are going to be incredibly important. Something to kind of think about is we're talking about stars on a moon, so the stars is actually going to be a lot like judging stars and star maps and like your astrological location based upon those stars is going to be actually more difficult here, because you're on a moon that rotates a planet that rotates a sun. Because of that, you're going to have a little bit different perspective depending on time of year, seasons, and things like that. And with navigation being so important, it's going to be worked out. But when I require a navigation check from you at night, I may increase the difficulty to represent that aspect of the world. I haven't decided for certain that I'm going to do that, but it is definitely something I'm considering. I've got Torvin, the god of tempest, charm, and enchantment. This was kind of a weird mix. I got this off of, well, all of these, I should say, I got this off of looking at the random chart and kind of randomly picking things. Forest and charm, or excuse me, tempest and charm and enchantment. It kind of makes me think of the phrase thunderstruck. like you're in shock and awe about something. And I thought that was actually kind of funny to have this god that was literally lightning and can thunderstrike you, but it can also leave you dumbfounded. So Torvin is actually kind of an interesting god. I've got Barius, which is the god of strength and war. Lytrix, which is fate and air. Let's see. Akrina, which is earth and animals, who is also a goddess. Akrina, I'm thinking I may make her evil to be in kind of a dichotomy with Mother Moon, for lack of a better term, right now. Or at least viewed as possibly like a misinterpreted god because by general people. Now, druids are probably going to dig Akrina, but the general populace, probably not the most popular god. I've also got Khazra, which is an unknown gender of god, which does plants and revenge. That one is definitely going to be evil. I liked that one because it made me think that Khazra could have a group of cultists that only use exotic plant venoms, which is kind of this weird, crazy idea to be able to use that common trope of using poison to get to your enemies, but in kind of a new, interesting way. And then I've got Bada Nazel, which is slime and suffering. This one was like my last two options on the chart once I got to the bottom here. Bada Nazel is a goddess, and I'm thinking that she should be a hag, like a witch. I've got this interesting idea that I want to do with humans and halflings. I'm thinking at least those two races are going to be from the book, understandable, but I'm going to change kind of their history. What I was thinking is I was going to have humans be just a standard normal race that's been in the world, but then there's hags, which are kind of this twisted dark creation, which I'm going to say that hags are created from Khazra. Just right now, I'm going to throw that out there. So Khazra creates the hags. The hags are so angry that they couldn't be beautiful like the humans, and so what they do is they kidnap human children and they curse them, which creates halflings. And halflings are going to start kind of like Dark Sun halflings. They're going to be cannibalistic, kind of vile, riding dinosaurs through the plains or whatever I decide to do with them, but they're gonna be not the best of people. Like, people are gonna fear the halfling barbarian, which in 5th edition you can totally do, and it's actually pretty funny because you're effective, which is part of the reason why I really like the idea of creating these halfling savages. And that's how their backstory is going to start. Now, I may change them so that they're more of a playable race, like maybe kind of like half orcs. You've come to this kind of begrudging understanding that the world accepts you to a degree, but still has racist hatred towards you. And I'm thinking maybe that's a good place for the halflings to sit. I'm generally not a huge fan of halflings, so putting the demonic light on them maybe makes them a little bit more interesting to me. I'm not a big fan of the small races for some reason. I don't find them as interesting. And I exclude dwarves there because I think dwarves are very interesting in their common lore. I just think common lore on gnomes and halflings needs a little something. To me, halflings, when you look at the book, it almost feels like, hey, we added a small race. They're lucky at stuff. And that's kind of the way it feels. Let me go ahead and put these notes down here. What I'd like to do is actually kind of talk about races next time. I kind of started that with what the halflings are. That one will probably be a pre-recorded one, not another hangout, depending on what I need the map for. If I have to play cities due to races, we may do another hangout again. For all of you that stuck around for this and any of the other videos, thank you. I mentioned it earlier this week. I am up to 25 subscribers. The one thing that I forgot to mention in that update is, unfortunately, next week I have to have that week off. I'm in college right now for the nursing program at my local school here, and I've got finals coming up, and so most likely my brain is going to be toast by Wednesday. So I'm probably going to take that day off. So next week I may go dark just for that Wednesday, and then I should be back. Luckily, I've got a couple weeks before my summer courses start. And another thing that I'm looking at is, I mentioned before that I was interested in doing some one-shots and possibly throwing those on my channel. Right now, I've been playing a couple because I kind of want to get my feet wet and let people know who I am on the community. But what I'm thinking is I've got a pretty good mech game that I am interested in, and I may end up making that the next game that I run online. It's called Remnants, if anybody wants to check that out. There is another game that is in playtest right now called Souls of Steel, and I'm talking to the creator of it right now to see if I can maybe get the playtest copy and run it, because it is in the Apocalypse World engine. Same basic principle. It's a mech fighting game. I don't know why. I just felt like maybe it's because I'm on this weird Power Rangers RPG kick right now. I just felt like mechs smashing fists and swords and launching rockets and machine guns at each other sounds like a great game to play. I'll probably, if it ends up being popular, what I'll do is I'll probably do at least 3 one-shots. If people like it and it kind of catches on, what I'm thinking is I'll do. I'll set a schedule, but I'm thinking what I'll do is set it up to where I have multiple one-shots. It's going to be the same command that's giving issues or giving orders, and it's going to be the same universe, and you guys are working towards an ultimate goal. Again, just like anything in the past, if anything in this video has sparked any sort of thoughts, ideas, or interest, if you happen to be interested in the mech idea or even this world, let me know, and we'll kind of talk about that and see about getting those of you that are expressing interest involved somehow on the channel with one of those projects. Now, that'll be it for tonight. I do apologize. I was having some technical issues, and that's why my video is showing up Wednesday into Thursday morning late. So thank you for that, and I will see you guys at the table.